That's the gospel. That's the whole gospel right there. That's available to you. That the second person of the Trinity wants to redeem you from evil. He wants your whole life. He wants to take you and shepherd you and walk with you, be with you.
Welcome to the Reach College Podcast with your speaker, Pastor Taylor Gabbard.
If you have ever bought a car, you know that what happens right after you buy a car is that you see that car everywhere. Not only do you see that car everywhere, but you will actually see the exact color of that car everywhere. Which is kind of annoying because you bought it and you thought you were a special songbird, and then everybody had it. I didn't even buy a Ford Bronco, but I would like to. I think they're cool. Not the sport model that looks so like a minivan, but the other ones. The ones that actually look like Ford Broncos, right? I would love to buy one of those, and I see them everywhere. I mean, I see them everywhere I look, right? And the reason that I see them everywhere I look is because that's what I'm looking for. And so there's this thing that happens in our spiritual lives where there's a concept, and it's called the hiddenness of God. And we very often think, why does God hide? Why can't we see God? Like, where is God? But very often, the truth about God being hidden is that we're not actually looking for him. Right? If you begin to look for God, you will begin to see him, right? And the more you look for God, the more often you can see him. Now, this can, I don't know that it's bad necessarily that this happens. I think that maybe, we're told to have faith like children, but you ever run into somebody who's like, I prayed and God gave me green lights all the way to work, right? And it's like, maybe, but again, I don't know that that's like the end of the world, because at the end of the day, I wish I was more on that end than on the end I tend to be on, right? Which is where, God's not involved, right? He's not present in everything I do, right? And I think that if we would begin to acknowledge how active God is in our lives, then we would actually see his hand in more places, right? And what happens is, it's always the people who aren't looking for God at all that they come to a crisis and then they ask God to do a backflip, right? They're like, well, God, if you would just act in this specific way in the next 10 seconds, then I would believe. And God doesn't often show up for that because he's not a trick dog, right? Like, that's not how we get to interact with him, right? But if we looked for him, we would actually see him in how he is already active. We're in the book of Genesis, and we've been in the Jacob. So the last portion of Genesis is the Jacob portion, right? It's about Jacob and his sons. And we've talked about how the narrative vehicle for the Jacob portion is Joseph, where we've been following Joseph through this entire narrative. And that's been telling us the story of Jacob and his sons. And then we also talked about how the main character is not actually Joseph. The main character of the Jacob portion, the Joseph narratives, is actually Judah. And the reason for that is because Judah is going to be the royal tribe, the tribe that carries on the seed that leads all the way to Jesus Christ. And where we start with Judah in this place where he literally is the ringleader of selling his brother into slavery. And we come to this culmination moment, the centerpiece of the Jacob portion of the story is when Judah is redeemed and acts Christ-like, in that while his brother is about to be enslaved, he says, no, take me instead. He does the most Christ-like thing he can do in that moment. It's an act of repentance, an act of redemption. He is finally the man we need him to be to lead the tribe that becomes the lineage of Jesus, right? And then that happens, and then we've gone back into Joseph portions of the story, or Joseph narratives, and Judah seems not as present. And the reason that's important to know today is because as we look at what's happening in chapter 48, it's almost just as important to notice what's missing in chapter 48. Okay, so what happens is that Jacob in this chapter is going to begin a series of blessings that are going to run all the way through chapter 49, where he's going to bless his sons and kind of proclaim what's going to happen with each of them. And Judah is going to be put in charge. Judah is going to be given the royal blessing, being told, like, you are the leader, like you're in charge of everybody, right? Even though Joseph has really been the son that's kind of saved everybody in this moment, Jacob is still going to bless Judah as that heir. And so today, as we look at the blessing that's going to fall on Joseph specifically, because Joseph essentially gets his own chapter, as we look at the blessing given to Joseph, we're going to notice that some of the key elements that we'll see in chapter 49 are not present, right? He's not giving some of these blessings to Joseph that we might even expect. And the author is almost even getting this blessing out of the way, if you will. It's almost like as Moses is writing this part, he's going, okay, time to wrap up Joseph so we can really talk about who this is all about anyway, right? And so as we look at this, we see that this kingship focus, this royal focus, is not with Joseph. And then the last thing I want you to see is it's important. This chapter, if you were just to read through it slowly by yourself, you would notice that it doesn't make sense chronologically. There's a lot of pieces of this story that seem to be like out of order. The reason is because when ancient Israelites, when they told stories in a lot of their narratives, the way you have to picture it, we tell stories in a linear fashion. We start at the beginning and we tell the events and then we get to the end. That's how we tell a story. That's not how they told stories. They told stories, you have to think about it like looking at a diamond. If you held a diamond up and you looked at a side of that diamond and then you described it and you said, this is what I see, this is what's going on. And then you turned that diamond and you began to describe this side of it. You'd still be describing the same diamond, but you would describe different elements of the diamond. You would see different things. And so what happens in this story especially, I'll call it out when it happens, but you'll see, I call it a nesting effect, because essentially they'll say, well, this is what happened. And then they move to the next part that's nested inside of that, and they go, and within that, this is what happened. And within that, this is what happened. But to our Western, modern mindset of storytelling, we're like, where are we in the story? What's happening, right? And so you need to understand that kind of structure, or else the story is very disjointed about what's happening. So the first thing we're going to see, look at Genesis chapter 47, starting in verse 28. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. Then the days for Israel to die drew near. And he called his son Joseph and said to him, please, if I have found favor in your sight, place now your hand under my thigh and deal with me in loving kindness and truth. Please do not bury me in Egypt. But I will lie down with my fathers, and you will carry me out of Egypt and bury me in the burial place. And he said, I will do as you have said. Then he said, swear to me. So he swore to him. Then Israel bowed in worship at the head of his bed. Okay, so the first thing we see is this phrase, to put your hand under my thigh. This is just kind of a ceremonial, symbolic gesture of taking an oath. It's essentially a sign of intimacy. He's saying, hey, I'm gonna have you swear on your mother's life kind of situation, right? This is a very serious vow that he's trying to get him to take, right? And so he says, come here and make this vow to me. And then essentially he says, don't bury me in Egypt. Don't leave me here when you go back. Now I want you to see what's so important about this statement from Jacob. It is inherently a statement of faith. Jacob believes God when God says, I'm going to give you a land. You're going to own that land. It's the land that your father Abraham and your father Isaac walked in. That land is going to be given to all your descendants. You are going to this is a gift from God to you. And even though he is literally dying in Egypt, not in the land, he believes God so much that he is saying, hey, whatever you do, take my bones back with you. Now, even that to us is like strange. It's like, who cares where your bones end up? But they had a different concept of the resurrection. See, if you go to Ezekiel and you start looking at the valley of the dry bones and things like this, what you'll understand as you look at the Jewish concept of the resurrection is it was very physical, literal. Like it was like your body is going to climb out of the grave or the tomb and be resurrected, be brought back to life. Now, it's not like zombies, like you're going to like look, alive. But the point is that they saw this in a very real way that at the end of time. Now, I want you to see this. We haven't talked a lot about the resurrection moving through Genesis because this is a very, very early time period for even understanding that concept. And the reason I want you to see that is because we have what's called progressive revelation. And progressive revelation is that throughout the Bible, God is clarifying and revealing more of himself. It becomes the most crystal clear it can become at Jesus' incarnation when he actually shows up. All of a sudden, we have this very crystal clear picture of the gospel. And then what happens for the rest of the New Testament? It's clarifying that clarity. I mean, it's literally just continuing to put it under a microscope and under a magnifying glass and say, okay, now look at this side of it. Now look at this aspect of it. And so this process of clarification oftentimes can be misinterpreted as though God developed a system along the way. Like he got to a point and then he was like, I guess we'll change that or add this. That is not the case. As a matter of fact, if you go back and you listen to the Genesis 3 podcast from this series, what I told you is that every single doctrine on sin for the whole Bible is in Genesis chapter 3. They start there. Now, they develop in some crazy amount of detail through the rest of the Bible, but none of them are new past Genesis chapter 3. They all start there. And so the same is true for things like the resurrection. It's not necessarily seen in Genesis the same way it's going to be seen in detail. Like by the time you get to Paul writing the letter to the Corinthians and being like, having a whole, just tirade on like what the resurrection is and how important it is. Yes, I get that that's even more granular. But the seeds of all of those same beliefs, they were with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They understood these things, even if they didn't understand them with the full clarity of us who have been blessed to have the full word of God, right? And so in this moment, Jacob is like, hey, when I resurrect, now again, he doesn't have maybe a full, I don't know that, anybody's going to resurrect and be like, I'm lost. Like, where am I? But like, he thinks like, I don't want to be anywhere else when we get brought back. Like when everything comes back and we're all finally there and we own this land that God has given us, I don't want to be like, well, I got to catch the bus from Egypt, right? And so he essentially is making this statement of faith, don't leave me behind. He has an eternal perspective. He has an eternal sight. He is seeing things. Now, keep in mind who we're talking about. This is Jacob. Jacob has lived with doubt. He has not trusted God. He has lived by what he has seen his whole life. Like it's when God finally dislocates his hip in a WWE wrestling match is the first time Jacob even begins to say, no, this is my God. This is who I follow, right? And even then, he still jacks plenty of stuff up. And now we fast forward all the way to the end of his life, and he has finally figured it out. He is looking for God everywhere he looks. He is having an eternal perspective. And what is half the argument in the New Testament is, if you would have an eternal perspective, it would fix all your problems. Because all your problems in the light of eternity start to look really, really small. And so that is what Jacob has learned. He's learned to live with this eternal perspective. Some of you may be hunters, and maybe you've used a spotting scope before. And a spotting scope is it's a very powerful magnification that you prop up like on a tripod, and you look through it. Well, if you've ever used a spotting scope before, one thing that you know is that the further out you get, the more powerful it is to see the further away, the less you can touch it at all without losing whatever it is you're trying to look at. When you get a spotting scope set up and you look at something very far away, you basically have to hover over it and look into it, because the moment you touch it, the thing you're looking at is a mile off course. You can't see it at all. And then you have to spin forever trying to get it readjusted. One of my favorite things is in Hollywood movies, they always like hold spotting scopes and they're just like, let me just look through this. And I'm like, no, like, not a chance, right? And so the thing about a spotting scope is you have to look, you're looking at something very far away, and if you move it at all, you lose sight. This is what it is to try to see God. You have to have this perfect alignment. You have to look out at something crazy hard for you to see, right? Without this assistance. And if you think about this, let's take this analogy a little bit further. What if you set up the spotting scope and it's aiming at the right thing and then you just walk away from it? That's how we handle our spiritual lives. We're like, I really want to see God, and I've got the tools to do it. I've got the Bible. I've got, church. I've got discipleship. But you know what? This morning I'm going to sleep in. And it's like, I don't know. I can't help you. If you don't use the tool, and if you don't use the tool correctly, then you cannot see what is out there. And in this moment, what Jacob is doing is he's demonstrating for us this eternal spiritual sight, right? This is why when I talk about if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can move a mountain. What is that verse telling us? People with faith can see God moving mountains, right? Faith is essentially looking for what God is doing already. It is seeing what God is up to. Here's the deal. God is active all around you, but you have to tune in. And if you don't tune in, nothing's going to show it to you. There's you don't have the ability to see it. Verse 31, Jacob is essentially, it's hard to tell exactly what's happening here. I read several things about this verse. He's either praying, worshiping, or he's exhausted. But either way, this is kind of wrapping up. He's wrapping up this conversation, and he's and now we're gonna move on. So immediately, the next section is going to be a nesting section, right? We're going to kind of move into a period of time that maybe this is covering, that this first portion is covering, okay? And what we're going to see is, now we're going to look at physical sight. You ever put on sunglasses, or put on, those of you who wear glasses, and there's a smudge, right? And what the smudge, it goes everywhere. It goes wherever you go, right? That's what you have to take it off. You have to wipe it off. You ever worn those Kanye glasses? If you ever worn those Kanye glasses too long, that's a problem, right? Because it's disruptive, right? It's disruptive to your sight. It's a physical object, right? What we're supposed to do is not put physical objects in the way of our ability to see physical things. What we're supposed to do is we're supposed to put a spiritual lens on that helps us see physical objects in the right way. Okay? Look at verse 1 of chapter 48. Now it happened after these things that Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is sick." So he took his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. Then it was told to Jacob, "Behold, your son Joseph has come to you." So Israel strengthened himself and sat up in bed. Then Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz, and in the land of Canaan, and blessed me. And he said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply, and I will make you an assembly of peoples, and I will give this land to your seed after you for an everlasting possession." Okay, so he begins to recount the spiritual blessings that God has given him. Now, the interesting thing is, first of all, he attributes all of these things to God Almighty. This is a name for God's sovereignty. And essentially, he's starting right off the bat to say, God who's in charge. Again, huge character change for Jacob. I know that we're doing this, weeks at a time over months that we've been in Genesis. But if you just read just the Jacob portions in one sitting, this is not the same guy that we start out with, okay? He's saying, no, God is in charge. He's sovereign over all. And then it's interesting because he actually is recounting God's promises, the blessing that we've seen passed on from generation to generation. But as he recounts it, he kind of adjusts it based on his understanding of what has actually happened in his life. So, for instance, the original "be fruitful and multiply," every time we've seen it, it's an imperative. It's a command. Go, be fruitful and multiply. But as Jacob recounts it here, the guy who has always tried to control his own life and make his own blessings come about, as he recounts it, he says, it's God that's done it. God said to me, I will make you fruitful and multiply. Right? Some of you have heard this story, and it's too transparent of an example for me to not use over and over again, especially in Genesis. I met a girl who told me that God had promised her that she was going to be a mom. And we could have a whole conversation right there about how God makes promises, but she said, God has promised me that I'll be a mom. So, already we're in trouble. So, if I don't meet the man I'm supposed to marry by whatever age, I'm going to go do IVF. What she's just said is, I don't actually believe God can bring about the thing that he has promised me. So if it looks a little bit, shaky to me that it might happen, I'll just go make sure it happens. Let's just rewind to when Abraham did that. And Sarah was like, look, I'm 90. Here's my servant, right? And that goes horribly. And that's the testimony of the Bible. If God makes a promise to you, he will keep it, right? And you don't have to manufacture the production of God's promises to you. And so what's happening here is Jacob, who has always tried to manufacture God's promises to him, is all of a sudden going, no, God said he would do this, and he has done it. He has made these things come true. So he's making it an acknowledgement of what God has done, not saying, well, I kept the commands. I did the things God charged me with, right? He also adds a phrase, everlasting possession. That phrase isn't in the original promise. Why? Because all of the sudden, Jacob, at the end of his life, has learned to see the promises of God with an eternal lens on them. See, this is what I tell you guys about, like, things that we get in this life, in and of themselves, are not fulfilling. They don't have the power to fulfill you, right? I always say that my wife is a fulfillment to me. She fulfills me because she is a gift from a God who loves me. In and of herself, she's just a human being. She doesn't have the power to just fulfill me. She's finite. And the problem inside of each one of us is that we need an infinite fulfillment. So only an infinite God can do that. Now, during this life, he gives us things as tokens of his love, right? And what happens? It's like if I've used this illustration before too. Somebody came up to you and said, man, a parent or somebody that you look up to, they said, hey, I love you so much. Here's this watch. I want you to remember me by this watch. It's a really nice watch. And instead of going, oh my gosh, this watch means so much because it came from you, you went, finally got that watch, don't need you anymore, right? That's what we do with God. I mean, especially, listen, and I'll call it out because this is the group to do it in, but that's especially what happens when we finally get that relationship that we've been waiting for, or that marriage that we've been waiting for. That's why you see the difference between people who view their marriages as gifts from God because they don't dip out on community. But people who view marriage as the point, just the watch they've been trying to get from God, as soon as they get it, they're gone. They disappear because they finally accomplished the thing. And that's missing the point. And those people, they have a hard time in marriage because all of a sudden the person they're married to isn't perfect. They have flaws. And they're like, oh, you suck sometimes. And it's like, yeah, both of us, right? That's the problem. I can't fulfill my wife. She can't fulfill me in and of ourselves. But as tokens of God's love to each other, that means something. That actually matters in a real way. And so all of the sudden, Jacob is looking at the promises God made to him that he thought were promises temporally. Think about this. We've had 3 generations now have been promised your descendants will number more than the sand on the seashores and the stars in the sky. He's got 12 sons. That's an easy number, right? Like, that's not numerous. But he all of a sudden has the right perspective on what God was telling him the whole time. It was an eternal blessing, an eternal promise. And here's the deal. He doesn't feel like gypped by that. He's not like, really, God? You just meant forever? He's like, no, wait a minute. That's better than just the 147 years that I was going to be on earth. It's better that God's promise to me is eternal and not temporal. He sees it in the correct way. His physical sight is affected by his spiritual lens. He also withholds a piece of this promise, and this is my point about what's missing. God has told each generation, kings will come from you, that your seed will rule, that they will be a kingly, and a blessing to all the generations. And in this moment, as this blessing is coming on to Joseph, those parts are omitted because those parts are going to be held specifically for Judah. Judah is going to get the royal part of this blessing, the part that actually leads to Jesus Christ. If you would begin to look for God everywhere, it would affect how you see things in this life. And again, a lot of us, I've started using this phrase actually just this week. I started thinking about it like this. A lot of us understand the big picture of the gospel. A lot of us understand that God has saved us for eternity. What we don't understand, the part we seem to be missing, is the small picture of the gospel, which is how it affects me right here, right now in my life. How does the gospel actually affect me today? This is why, by the way, that God lets us live in a physical world, because spiritual realities are so hard to see. Think about this. Why do we do the Lord's Supper? We do the Lord's Supper because it's a physical way for you to see that you are spiritually receiving Christ into yourself. Christ is in you if you're saved. And we do the Lord's Supper as a physical object lesson of that. It's a reminder. When you take the Lord's Supper, you go, oh, Christ is in me. Just like when we eat this piece of bread and we say it's his body, and then I consume it. He's inside of me. Right? That is an object lesson to teach you something. Think about this. Why did Jesus incarnate and become human? Because the question for all of Judaism leading up to Jesus' arrival was, where can God be seen? He was spiritual. And not only was God a spiritual reality that couldn't be seen, but every time that they had come close to God, it had been overwhelming. Right? The two great moments that you have to compare side by side is the incarnation of Jesus Christ next to God on Mount Sinai. Because when God came on Mount Sinai, they couldn't even get close to the mountain. They were that scared. And God is essentially has that moment with them to show, you guys need me to come in a physical form like you so that we can actually have a conversation. So I can actually teach you what I'm trying to teach you. So you can physically see what I'm trying to spiritually do for you. That had to happen because God, in his form, not only could we not get close to him because of sin, but we're living in this physical world trying to see spiritual realities, and God was this abstract, removed concept to us until he became, as the disciples say, they felt him, they touched him, they ate with him, they listened to him. Their physical senses were affected by a very real man named Jesus. That's important. Look at verse 5. So now your 2 sons who are born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. But your kin that have been born after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the names of their brothers in their inheritance. Now, as for me, when I came from Paddan, Rachel died to my sorrow in the land of Canaan on the journey, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. Okay. So first of all, just as a side note of Jewish customs and laws, again, we're in the time before really all the laws were written out, but part of the way Moses wrote the Torah was he was pointing out that the codified law that he gives later, that the patriarchs lived by that. They already did it. It was laid on their hearts, and they lived that out in faith. And so one of the things that is in the law is a firstborn son, that the firstborn son to dad can adopt his sons, right? And so in this moment, Ephraim and Manasseh are being adopted from Joseph, except that Joseph's not the firstborn, which is why he mentions Reuben and Simeon, right? That's a good dating name, right? Reuben. So he mentions the two that should be first and second oldest. Why? Because Reuben and Simeon both disgraced their names and their father's names and lost their firstborn rights and blessings. And those firstborn rights and blessings were given to Joseph. But this is where things get tricky, right? Only the physical part of the firstborn blessings were given to Joseph, because Judah, who's the thirdborn, he's the one that gets the firstborn blessing spiritually. See what's happening? There's a split here between the firstborn blessing that the whole time it's been the same. The blessing of the right to the land and the blessing of the seed have been held in the same person for generations. And now all of a sudden, they're splitting. The right to the land is moving to Joseph, but the right to the seed is going to move to Judah, right? And so this is a big difference. And so what's happening in this moment is that Jacob, he references his first and second oldest that should be receiving the right to the land. And he's saying, no. Instead, I'm going to exercise my right to adopt my firstborn, which has moved to Joseph. I'm going to adopt his two sons, and they're going to be my sons. And here's the deal. This is a huge benefit to them, because think about this. All that Jacob owns is about to be split into 12 parts, right? And Joseph's going to get a portion of that, and then he's going to split that between his two sons. But if they all of a sudden are adopted by Jacob, they get first round pick of the inheritance. It's coming straight to them. And so what we're going to see is that some of this, there's going to be this massive benefit to them, because for the rest of the Old Testament, we never hear about the tribe of Joseph, because Ephraim and Manasseh become their own tribes. They are now all of a sudden in the group, right? And then if you do the math, that's 13 tribes. But Levi, right, his tribe, their inheritance is that they have the privilege, the honor of working in the tabernacle and eventually the temple. They don't get a land allotment. So the land allotment that's supposed to go to Levi, and I think this is in Isaiah is actually spelled out somewhere, but that land allotment that's supposed to go to Levi instead becomes the land allotment that goes to Ephraim and Manasseh, so that we stay at 12 land allotments, even though we have 13 tribes. And they're called the 12 tribes of Israel for the rest of forever, right? And the Levites are just dispersed throughout all of them, because their privilege was getting to be the ministers of God's presence to all the tribes. It never manifests more than when they're walking around the wilderness setting up the tabernacle, because the tabernacle was in the center of camp. And the Levites got to camp the closest to the tabernacle. Not only was it the safest place from everything on the outside, it was also just the closest place to God, which is the greatest place you can be ever. They got that blessing, right? And so in this moment, we start to see this unfold. And another key here is, like, if you just reading through this again, it seems weird, because he's like talking about adopting Ephraim and Manasseh, and then he's like, anyway, when Rachel died, and it's like, hold on, what are we talking about? But the reason he's bringing that up is because he is talking, there's two things that he's emphasizing there. One is he's reaffirming the reality of God's faithfulness and blessings, because he's saying, hey, we buried her at Bethlehem. Don't leave me in Egypt. That's why I want you to take me with you. And also he's referencing the fact that she only gave him two sons, and now through Joseph, one of her sons, because those were his two favorites, right? Joseph and Benjamin. And he says, through my love, who only was able to give me two sons, I'm going to have two more sons, because I'm going to adopt these two as my very own, right? And so this is a huge blessing to him. He sees God's faithfulness, because when Rachel died, it was like she died, and then Joseph is sold into slavery, and all he had was Benjamin. And he spent just decades, holding on to Benjamin, just mourning his wife. And now all of a sudden he's able to look and go, look at what God has done. Look how faithful God was to me. Even though I lost Rachel and for a time I lost Joseph, now all of a sudden I've actually gained Joseph back and I have 2 more sons that are products of my time with Rachel. And so this is a huge blessing to him. Again, he's seeing his physical world through spiritual eyes. Look at verse 8. Then Israel saw Joseph's sons and said, "Who are these?" Okay, pause. This is another nesting portion, okay? There's 2 options here. Either it's the beginning of a formal statement, so it's like, like when somebody looks at they're like a grandparent looks at their grandchild and goes, "And who is this?" Right? So it could be like kind of this formal introduction that's happening, but it's weird because it's like they're in the room and he's talking about them and he goes, "Who's that?" Right? And so the other thing we're going to see is that he has bad eyesight, but it most likely is that it's nested into this bigger picture, right? So we're turning the diamond and we're looking at it from a different angle, okay? So he says, "Then Israel saw Joseph's son and said, 'Who are these?' And Joseph said to his father, 'They are my sons whom God has given me here.' So he said, 'Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them.' Now the eyes of Israel were so dim from age that he could not see. Then Joseph brought them close to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. Then Israel said to Joseph, 'I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your seed as well.' Then Joseph took them from his knees and bowed with his face to the ground." Okay. So, verse 10, it says he can't see. And again, this is key, right? Because what the author's going to mention his sight like 3 times here. And the point is the author is trying to get at his physical sight is obliterated. And yet, from here through chapter 49, he is able to see things that he shouldn't be able to know at all because they're in the future. And so he literally is having spiritual sight that surpasses his physical sight completely. Here's the thing, part of the distraction in our lives at a young age is that we're healthy. This is what life's about. And when our bodies begin to deteriorate later in life and suddenly stop functioning as well, all of a sudden we begin to ask the question, like, is this really what everything's about? Right? Because our spirits know that there's still something coming, right? Even though our bodies are like, oh, where's the finish line on this, right? And so in this moment, his physical sight is basically destroyed. And in verse 11, he says, even though I can't see, I was able to be blessed with what God has given me. I've seen my descendants through Joseph, who I thought I lost, right? So he has fully put his spiritual filter on his physical sight. The next thing we're going to see is what I've called generational sight. There are 2 things that we would do a lot more if we truly believed. If you truly believe and you're reacting to the gospel, the 2 things that you will naturally do, one is that you will pray. If you believe God is there, you will talk to him. If you believe God can help you, you will talk to him. It is when we don't believe God will come through, or we don't want God to come through the way he wants to come through, that we don't talk to him. And the second thing that we will do if we truly believe is that we will spread. We will make disciples. We will be fruitful and multiply. See, when we believe God, we can't help but overflow with that into other people. We will tell people about Jesus. Look at verse 13. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand towards Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand towards Israel's right, and he brought them close to him. But Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, crossing his hands, although Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, "May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd throughout my whole life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless these boys, and may my name live on in them, and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." But Joseph saw that his father set his right hand on Ephraim's head, and it was displeasing in his sight. So he took hold of his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also will become a people, and he also will be great. However, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become the fullness of nations." Okay, so what happens? The firstborn, Manasseh, is on Joseph's left side, and then Ephraim is on Joseph's, he's got whichever way to walk them up to where all Jacob has to do is reach out and touch him, right? And his right hand will be on Manasseh's head, and his left hand will be on Ephraim's head, right? And then that's how he's going to bless him. Okay, now the funny thing is, Joseph blames this incorrect, hand placement on his eyesight. Except that eyesight actually can't be the problem, because what would cause somebody with bad eyesight to be like, probably this? So this has to be intentional, right? He crosses his hands and he is trying to bless Ephraim with his right hand and put the firstborn blessing on him. Now, this is interesting. If we go back, how does Jacob, the younger brother, under Esau, how does he get blessed? Because he tricks Isaac, his father, into blessing him with the blessing of the firstborn. He deceives him because Isaac can't see, right? He fools him, and now in this moment, he can't see, and yet he chooses to bless the younger. This is an absurd moment, right? Where Jacob is intentionally going out of his way to put the wrong hand on the wrong kid according to what they would expect. And what have I told you guys about this? There's this motif that runs all the way. I mean, we're talking Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel, the younger son, is the one that God has favor on in that moment. And then Seth, who's the thirdborn, he becomes the leader of the spiritual side of the family, right? Cain wanders the earth as a murderer, right? And every iteration of the family, except for Isaac, who was alone, right? And even Isaac did have an older brother, right? Ishmael wasn't born to Sarah, but the point is, every step of the way, not the firstborn, not the one that everybody thinks should get the blessing, gets the blessing. Why? Because God refuses, through the entire book of Genesis, to let anybody take credit for what he is doing. See, all along the way, if the firstborn gets it at any point, it's like, yeah, of course, obviously, the firstborn, which is exactly why God undermines that at every single step. He goes, no. This has nothing to do with your being firstborn, you having some level of merit, because you're owed it. This is because I'm doing it. I'm causing this to happen. Now think about where Jacob is on this. Jacob stole the blessing and then has lived his whole life basically trying to solve his own problems. And now all of a sudden, Jacob has come so full circle, he actually thinks, no, wait a minute. God doesn't do it the way that we do it. He can see what God wants. Here's the thing. When you grow in spiritual maturity, one of the most gratifying things, some of you, I think, are going through this phase right now. You early have to learn this problem. Oh, I very often want things God doesn't want. Well, then there's this weird transition that happens. You do that long enough, and then all of a sudden I have to have this conversation with you. Hey, just because you want it doesn't mean it's bad. Right? Because very often it'll be like, oh, I want this thing. That must mean it's sinful. And God's like, no, I'm actually giving you that. Why? Because the more we grow with him, the more what we want and what God wants are aligned. That's why the Bible says, seek him first, and then you will get the desires of your heart. Because as you seek God, the desires of your heart become his desires. Right? It's a transition. Jacob is so far in towards the end of his life that he wants exactly what God wants in this moment. He wants that the way he can actually see the way that God is going to handle this situation, and he plays a part in that. He volunteers for it. Again, not the same Jacob we start with, but a drastic example of how, as we grow in spiritual maturity and we have this sight, this spiritual sight, we begin to understand how God works, right? A lot of times, listen, there's a lot of times that, first of all, again, we're back to like, not all of you are the bright songbird individual that you think you are. But what happens is one of you will bring me a problem, and then like a week later, Another one of you will bring me the identical problem. And very often, what do? I go to the same verse. Why? Because I've seen how God handles this, how God walks through this situation, how God wants to help you grow through it. Well, that's not because I figured out this, like, I'm just like, man, I got this covered. Because honestly, if I thought I had this covered, every time you told me something, I would have to figure out what is my advice in this situation. What's my new wise counsel? But that's not the key. The key is that God is completely consistent. So if I figure out how God reacts to things in his perfect consistency, then when people bring me the same problems, I go, oh, there's something for this. And I have the same place to go for it. And so that is this wonderful thing that happens as we begin to see God's generational consistency. That the same God, here's the deal, why do they keep reaffirming? Why does Jacob constantly say, well, the God of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac? Because he's pointing out that it's the exact same God with the exact same promises. Hadn't changed not one single bit. You realize the same is true for you? Like, the God you serve today is the same God that Jacob serves, that Joseph served, the same God that Jesus came as and proclaimed, like the same God that Paul walked with, that's the same God you have. So when you read the crazy faithfulness of God in these stories, which, by the way, that's really what this entire chapter is about, God's faithfulness. That's what Jacob is realizing at the end of his life, is how faithful God has been. That faithfulness is available to you. It's not alien from you. And by the way, it's not even dependent on how well you perform, as Jacob himself proves. He does a pretty bad job, and God is faithful to him. But you don't have to wait. You know, what did he say last week? We talked about the phrase he used. He said, my years have been few and miserable. Why? Because he wasn't on board with what God was doing most of the time. You want your life to go well? It's not the prosperity gospel that if you just pray, believe hard enough, like God will just give you good things. It's that if you are seeking Jesus to be wherever he is and do whatever he's doing and be a part of whatever he has for your life, then even in the bad situations, you'll have joy and contentment. Meanwhile, if you chase the world, you won't have joy and contentment no matter what you're doing, no matter what kind of physical blessings fall on you. There is a perspective on life that leads to being able to say, what Paul says, I can do anything, right? I can have a little, I can have a lot. I can endure because I have the right perspective on the world around me. And Jacob's only at the end of his life really, really realizing this. You're not going to make it to 147. I can promise you that. So you don't have time to get to 147 before you figure this out. You got to figure this out now. You got to understand what God is doing with you now. It's interesting. He says, God as my shepherd, and he refers to an angel. And it's interesting because the angel that has visited their family over and over again, it's easy. I'm not going to go through the whole angel of the Lord theology thing, but ideally, that's a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, right? They have talked with the second person of the Trinity. They have interacted with Jesus, who is taking a personal interest in the gospel, marching forward one generation at a time. And essentially, he says of this angel has redeemed me from evil. That's the gospel. That's the whole gospel right there. That's available to you. That the second person of the Trinity wants to redeem you from evil. It wants your whole life. It wants to take you and shepherd you and walk with you and be with you. You just, really, the only part you play in that is stop fighting it. Stop resisting it and be receptive of what God wants to do. Look at verse 20. And he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel pronounced blessing, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh, Then Israel said to Joseph, "Behold, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you back to the land of your fathers. And I give you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow." All right, so again, this is what I'm talking about. The firstborn, the promise of the land to the firstborn was they got double portion. Well, that firstborn promise has now moved to Joseph. Well, now Joseph's two sons each get a portion of land. Whereas had they not been, brought up to that level, adopted and given this double portion, they are splitting Joseph's portion essentially, right? And so this is a blessing on them. They receive this double portion of the land. He makes this weird reference to taking it from the Amorites by the sword and the bow. Amorites was a synonymous term with Canaanites, right? So it's just a reference to the people in the land. What he's talking about with the sword and the bow, it's either unknown to us, as in we just don't have a record of what he's talking about that's not mentioned in Genesis. It's either unknown, it could be a reference to the future conquest of Israel. That seems less likely. And maybe even it's a reference to when Simeon and Levi killed people, all the Shechemites, right? And so essentially it could be a reference to that battle, and maybe we don't have until here the understanding that after they, killed that village, because it says that they plundered them, right? They took all their things after they killed all the men. Well, maybe they owned that land afterwards too, right? So they do have this now portion of land that they've essentially conquered, right? None of whatever version of that it is doesn't necessarily matter to us, because we do know that Israel's going to come in later, and there's going to be a conquest of the land, and then they're going to divvy out these portions of land to each of the tribes. The question that you want to take away from this passage is, what are you focusing on? I mean, where's your focus? Where's the thing that you're paying attention to? Are your goals all for and in this world, right here, right now? Can you hold everything you want in your hand? Because if you're doing that, you're missing the point. You're missing why God leaves us here to do these things, which, by the way, the total opposite can be true. Do you not have any goals? Do you understand the big picture of the gospel and have no idea what you're doing today? Because God has left you here in a physical world so that you can physically serve Him, right? We're not mystics. I'm not telling you go sit in a cave and meditate until you transcend time and space, right? Like, be in the physical world. Serve God in physical ways, right? Not because those physical things earn you something, but more or less because they teach you something. They make you into somebody. Serve God because you want to see the reality of the spiritual truth that He is producing inside of you. That's why we have physical goals. There's nothing wrong with having physical goals until they become idols, until they become your gods. Where is your focus? What are you paying attention to? Can you see God everywhere? That's it.
Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, I want to personally invite you to come to Reach. We meet every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at Evergreen Baptist Church in South Tulsa, just east of Mingo on 111th Street. For more information, you can visit our website, evergreenbc.org, or follow us on any social media platform at reach.tulsa.